The light is only slightly blinding, but that'll work. Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the 2008-2009 Science Technology Society series, the Linus Pauling Lectures, Memorial Lectures. My name is Terry Bristol, and I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, and it's the institute that organizes this. However, we would not be here were it not for our co-sponsors and supporters, and it's my pleasure at this stage of the game to thank them. First and foremost, our major corporate co-sponsor for a number of years and stalwart is Mentor Graphics Corporation. Big hand for them. And then I'm going to go down the list here. Oregon Episcopal School, FEI Company, Oregon University System, which is the Chancellor's Office, and then matched by Portland State University, University of Oregon, Western Oregon University, ONAMI, which is down at Oregon State, that's the nanotech guys, Portland Community College, Mount Hood Community College, Clark College, Vancouver, new co-sponsor FLIR Systems, Lewis and Clark College, Pacific University, and the Oregonian, and with a special thanks to the Heathman that backs us up. So everybody make sure cell phones are dead or off or diverted, just in case. And so Q&A after Dr. Leakey's talk, there are 3 mics, Doop, and there, and he will take questions after his talk. And somebody's cell phone's going out. I hear that. Thank you. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce the introducer, and we're happy to have this new co-sponsor, which is FLIR Systems. And if you don't know, FLIR is infrared stuff. That's what they do. And we are lucky to have the Chief Technical Officer, a guy named John Lester Miller. He's been with the company for 12 years, and the Chief Technical Officer for their government division. He has degrees in physics and astronomy and has previously worked at the Mauna Kea observatories and at Mount Wilson and Palomar observatories. He's authored over 60 papers and 4 books on infrared and photonics, and we're going to book him up to do a good science cafe later, because he's a man looking for an audience, I've decided, and he's brilliant and he's very good. So it's my pleasure to introduce John Lester Miller.
Thank you, Terry. Good evening, Portland. It is wonderful to address an audience that respects and honors science and reason in engineering. And what a great lecture series this is. FLIR is proud to be a sponsor. And thank you, Terry, for arranging all of this. I am into physical sciences, unlike our guests tonight. I work at FLIR, and at FLIR, we do infrared imagery. We form images and make cameras and systems that form images using the infrared spectrum, the light beyond that your eyes can see. We give alien vision to humans. What's interesting about the infrared is 2 phenomena. One is we all glow at the wavelength we form images on. So there is no night and day. So poachers at night can be easily seen with the infrared. Additionally, hot objects emit more. So a lot of zoos use our infrared sensors to look at their animals. When you have a hurt elbow, you go to a doctor and complain. When an elephant has a sprained leg, he can't complain, but it starts swelling up, and even before it swells up, the blood goes there and it gets warmer. We also use infrared for bats. Our systems are around a number of bat caves, especially in Texas, counting bats. We can do very accurate counting of bats flying in and out of caves in the infrared. And also for conservation and anti-poaching. Kruger National Park uses our sensors, and Dr. Leakey has tried our sensors on aircraft to also try to get poachers at night. Dr. Leakey is a politician, but don't hold that against him, because he's also a conservationist and a scientist. In 1989, he became director of the Kenyan Wildlife Service, and in 1999, the head of Kenyan Civil Service. He is a constant fighter of corruption in Africa and Kenya, even forming his own political party. Academically, he holds 12 doctorate degrees and is currently a professor at SUNY in New York. He was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 greatest minds of the 20th century. And He grows grapes and makes wine, something near and dear to a lot of Oregonians. I'm in airborne surveillance, and I think one of the great hallmarks and events in airborne surveillance was done by Dr. Leakey in 1967. He was flying from Omo to Nairobi and using a very old electro-optical system, the Mark I human eye, although he did have a very good processor behind it, the brain of Richard Leakey. But using his eye, he identified a sedimentary outcropping that he thought would hold fossils. And it turned out it did. In fact, Dr. Leakey in his career has found and analyzed over 2,000 fossils that tell the story and build the framework of hominid evolution. He increased mankind's knowledge and allowed us to understand where we are today. Among his discoveries is Turkmenoboy, almost complete skeleton of Homo erectus. I had the opportunity of seeing the skeleton, the fossils, at a museum, and I asked the guard, "How old is it?" And he said, 1.6 million, 2 years and 2 months. And I was taken back a little bit and said, "How do you know so accurately?" He said, "Well, sir, I've been working here 2 years and 2 months, and when I started, they told me it was 1.6 million years." In closing, there are 2 points I'd like to make about this little story. One is to the young people out there and the students who are thinking of a career in science and engineering. There's still a lot to be discovered. We have a strong framework. We understand how the world works, but it would be nice to have not 1.6 million plus or minus some, but to actually try to get it down more accurately, to fill in to get better resolution and precision on the evolutionary path. And also in physical science, the Large Hadron Collider isn't going to be the end. There will be more physical science. And filling in the gaps is a noble cause. And it leads to great discoveries. It's what Einstein did. Newtonian mechanics was working fine and describes our everyday life, with the exception of GPS, but describes our everyday life very accurately. And it wasn't until Einstein came along and refined it with relativity and general relativity, which incidentally GPS has to use a relativity correction. Also, Max Planck. Max Planck, in an equation near and dear to my heart, the black body equation, he solved by quantizing the energy. And by quantizing the energy, he ripped open 20th century physics and quantum mechanics. And the second point is, for anybody out there that doesn't believe hominids have been walking in Africa 1.6 million years ago, then please don't plug your blow dryer into the socket. Because that electricity may have been generated by a nuclear power plant using the same equations, the same science that's used to date fossils. We live in an era, we are pleased to live in an era where we stand on giants such as Dr. Richard Leakey. We may not know everything, but we know a lot. And we know a lot because of great men like Dr. Richard Leakey. And I'm honored to introduce him.
One of the things about staying backstage is you hear a lot of nonsense. Thank you anyway for that very and more than generous introduction. It's difficult to know where to begin. I've been asked to talk about why it's important for us to know about our origins, and I think that would be rather presumptive of me to tell you why it's important for you to know. I can only tell you why it's important for me to know, and I will give you my perspective on the science, my perspective on the global situation related to the contemporary species, and perhaps speculate a little about issues that will affect the future of our species. I would also point out, as I think I've done before in other fora, but not necessarily here, that I'm well aware that I am in the United States of America, and I'm well aware that in the United States there seems to be a large number of people who don't believe in evolution. If any of you slipped in here by error, it's time to leave. Or else, as a courtesy, keep your thoughts to yourself and attend another lecture later that's about your views rather than mine. But I don't want to get into any debate on this subject because it'll keep us here too late, and I don't want to do that. So let me begin and say that why is it important to know who we are? And I think the first thing to ask and reflect on, which I do frequently, is who are we? What is a human? Is it any one of us? Or is it people who aren't here but might live somewhere else? What is it about us that interests me? What sets us apart from other species that are not that different, but nonetheless are very different in that no other species would attend a lecture and be arrogant enough to try and understand the importance of the reason that they came. So we are clearly very different, and yet in reality probably not that different. So let us begin with one of the first and critical issues that I think has concerned many people, both in science and in non-scientific circles, and that is, if it's true, as indeed I would propose to suggest and talk as if it is true, that we have an evolutionary history, at what point did we become human? And at what point, if you like, did we separate from our ancestors? And many of you will have been to college and school and been taught about this fictional notion that there's a missing link. And one of the things that people are always saying, well, you haven't found the missing link that links us as humans to them that are not humans, the apes. And this goes back, if you like, to the very early days when evolution was being put about by Charles Darwin and his cohorts. And it's a problem that afflicted the acceptance of their position and has continued to be a point at which people are uneasy. And this is, when did we evolve? When did we descend, or when did we ascend from the apes? And I think the answer has to be, we haven't yet. And I think it's important to understand that. I have often said in other opportunities to speak on this subject that if we had not done the classification ourselves, we would not have been in a separate family from the chimpanzees and the gorillas. But there was a certain amount of self-interest, perhaps, embarrassment, uncertainty, various other things. And it's rather like if you go, and there's a magnificent zoo, or there used to be, here in this city. I remember coming to the zoo in Portland many years ago when it moved to its location, had a new director, and people were very excited. And I think if you go there quietly and you look at the exhibit on the chimpanzees or the apes, you look at people looking at them rather than looking at the apes, it's not difficult to persuade yourself of the similarities. Even though you may not see them as similar to you, they're certainly similar to some of those over there. And I think you can test this, it's fairly common experience. But in reality, the similarity between us and apes, or the other apes, particularly the chimps and bonobos, is close to 99%, slightly more than 99% in some people's ideas. And in that sense, we are much closer to the chimpanzee than a horse is to a donkey. And you all know what horses and donkeys can do together if given the opportunity. And one of the important questions is whether or not anyone has ever carried out that experiment to see whether we could in fact produce. And I had thought, until very recently, that this was such a morally reprehensible thing to subject a chimp to that, it couldn't possibly have happened. But I learned to my amazement a month ago, that they have just started to open up some of the historical archives that are stored in Germany, left over from the pre-Second World War years, Nazi Germany. And indeed, there was a gentleman, a professor, who set out to do exactly what we would consider morally reprehensible. And he went off to Central Africa with a specific mission of collecting a group of chimpanzees with whom he could experiment as to whether there was indeed a possibility of a fertile cross, and if there was, to see if they could raise these offspring to a point when one could start to interrogate them as to what each side might represent to them, and whether that perhaps there could be some form of communication. I think fortunately, although at the time it was considered unfortunate in Germany, and I think much has changed since then, it wasn't possible in the country of Africa where this was being done, in what was a West African country then, but under colonial rule, to carry out the experiment as he had planned, and that was to use what they called in those days native women to participate in this experiment. And you'll notice who was to be experimented on. It wasn't the native men, but the native women, which is again a characteristic of those years and those people who were doing this experiment. But the local women were considered sufficiently low down the order of things that they could be subjected to this experiment in fertility. Fortunately, the colonial governor of the state put a stop to this. It seemed as though there were likely chances that war would break out. This was in the late 30s. There was some concern that this German professor and his team would get isolated in Africa because of the outbreak of war. And so he collected his group of chimpanzees and he returned to Germany with his chimpanzees, which began to die in droves. They were not being well looked after, they were not being well fed, and he never got round to carry out his experiment, fortunately. But what he did write in his memoirs, and one of these days somebody will publish them, is that he had 4 women, German women, who had offered their bodies to be inseminated by chimp sperm to see what would come out as a result. I cannot imagine anything more ghastly than that German's intent. It didn't happen, and I have never heard of any other attempt by anybody to do something seriously in that regard. But notwithstanding that, one has to pose the question that we are remarkably similar to chimpanzees, remarkably similar. And in that similarity, we are, as I said, we are closer to them than horses to us. And yet we are manifestly very different, fundamentally different, in the way we behave, the way we articulate thoughts, the way we think, the way we live in the environment, and things of that kind. So there is an intriguing scientific question as to which genes and which part of the genetic makeup and when that came about has separated us so far from an animal, an ape, another ape that is so clearly very similar to us in many, many regards, particularly genetically. So that's one issue. And one can say definitely we are not chimpanzees, although chimpanzees and we may share a common ancestor, we are very different. But who are we? We can go back to sepia-colored photographs of our grandparents and go back to the age when photographs were first being developed, and you find it interesting to look at your relatives, your great-grandfather and great-grandmother, their children, members of the family, but we can't go very far back, and we have to take on faith what people looked like when they came over as pilgrims in the Mayflower and things of that kind in this country. And if you go further back into the early periods of Europe, we have to take on faith that those people in the 14th century, the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, were in many cases people that we assume were like us because we are told knowledge is passed on, their photographs. But the further back you go, you wonder. And one of the big question marks that science has had to look at is the people who did prehistoric art, painting on the inside of cave walls, clearly had a conscious faculty. They were able to depict things that they had seen at some point. They were able to invoke perhaps some sense of spirituality or magic or myth into the paintings. And some of those people were living and painting those caves 15, perhaps 20,000 years ago. So even that far back, there were people that probably we could identify with. But how much farther back can we take us as we are here tonight? And how different are we? I mean, clearly when the lights come up, you can look around. There's some people who would say the same as you, and there's some people who would say, no. That's not us at all, that's them. And this is one of the banes of our life, this separation of people into race, separation of people into language. And this divisive strategy that has been employed is quite worrying. And one of the reasons anthropology has been so shy of tackling modern people and the differences between us is that at the time this German professor was looking to examine the chimpanzee relationship with humans in terms of fertility, other German scientists were developing the idea, which was extremely popular with Adolf Hitler, and that is that you could actually breed a pure race. You could eliminate, and hence the origin of the Holocaust and the disastrous things that happened in terms of the way the Nazi government felt it should deal with humans that they felt were inferior. And in many cases, anthropologists had been used to substantiate differences, not only between the pigmentally challenged races, and I say pigmentally challenged because that's where the prejudice was first showing up, Aryan against Jew and things of that kind, but more so perhaps, and perhaps less known, is that they justified colonization, they justified slavery, they justified treating other people as if they weren't really people, they were at a lower level. And anthropologists got into a lot of trouble because they willingly went along in many cases with political efforts to justify bad practice and bad governance. But notwithstanding those comments, I think it's important to point out that in Africa today there are, who knows, several 100,000 chimpanzees scattered around the forests of the Congo and Central West Africa. These are big areas, as big as the Amazon basin. Chimpanzees have been there, as far as we know, a very long time. And in the last decade, people have been taking genetic samples from these populations of chimpanzees, and we have learned that chimpanzee populations that may be just 500 miles apart are more different from each other than we are to each other. Not to chimps, but the genetic similarity to all living people is far greater than the genetic similarity between different populations of chimpanzee living in the forest. And what this tells us is that there was a moment in time that basically shrunk the human population into a very small number of individuals, and those individuals survived and gave rise to the genetic stock from which we are all derived, whether we're living in Central Australia as some of the indigenous people of Australia, whether you're living in North America as indigenous as opposed to migrant, or whether you're living in Central Africa. Wherever you live as a modern human, you're more closely related to every other modern human than various populations of chimpanzee are related to each other. When was this bottleneck? As far as we can tell, it was around 65,000 years ago. And some of you will have read about this and recognized that this was the so-called mitochondrial Eve. This was the putative mother of us all. Obviously, it wasn't one mother, but it was a very small population, and only a small population could adequately explain our genetic similarity today. And it was about 65,000 years ago. There had been people not distinct from us, as far as we can tell, on their bony structures, anatomical structures, that got out of Africa and were all over Africa earlier than 65,000 years ago. And their fossil remains of Homo sapiens, 100,000, 120,000, in different parts of Africa. You've got the Neanderthals going back to 65, 70,000 years ago, and you've got various other examples of Homo sapiens to which we're not related. And a few years ago, they were successful in recovering some DNA material and have established now beyond any doubt that despite what we see when we go to airports, particularly large airports, there are no Neanderthal genes in us. And that always that surprised me, because I must confess, I've always enjoyed delays at airports because you get a magnificent opportunity to sit back and watch the variation of human types that go by, their temperaments. And until a few years ago, I was quite sure that Neanderthal had come through and was mixed up in some of that. But that was the wrong track. Neanderthal had nothing to do with us, and we're going to have to accept the results of that research. So, good story, bad ending, but there we are. But what about these 65,000-year-old people? What do we know about them? Absolutely nothing at the moment. One of the interesting things we do know is that of the 7 basic languages that are the stem for all languages spoken today, and some that are no longer spoken because the populations have been mixed and the small language groups have disappeared. Of the 7, 5 of those languages are definitely African in origin, and they seem to be the oldest of the 7. It's also quite clear that if you're a linguist and you work with the rules that they use, there seems to be some suggestion that language may also be around 60,000 years older in terms of its origin. I'm not sure how that's worked out. I've been out of that side of the business for some time, but ancient people seem to have developed language about the same time as the population that gave rise to the world's population today. Of course, one of the questions that intrigued me is why, if there were people all over Europe and Africa who were Homo sapiens, did a small population manage to get rid of everybody and just themselves survive and populate the earth? What was it? There's no evidence that it was warfare. There was no evidence that it was cannibalism. There was no evidence that it was disease, and that you don't find massive accumulations of pre-anatomically modern humans in deposits. But what was it? A different way of life has to be very different for it to be successful and eliminate the other. And one of the intriguing questions that needs an answer is, could it have been language? Because if you speak and you can articulate thought, both in terms of past, present, and future tenses, if you can plan and if you can use historical knowledge in the survival strategy, you would have a tremendous advantage over a very similar species that, although it could communicate, didn't really have the syntactical ability to put things in a context. And I think one of the big challenges of the next decade is to look more closely at modern humans and to look more closely at the last 60, 70,000 years in the geological and archaeological records of Africa, and see if we can actually find this transition and see if there's anything in it that we can begin to tease this information out. And I think, whilst I have devoted much of my life to looking for the very ancient evidence of humanity, which I'll also talk about, I think to a certain extent, if I were to start from scratch today, I would look at the last stages of humanity rather than the first stages of humanity. And one of the reasons for that, which I'll share with you, because I think it's a point that at least gets some of you thinking about it, is that I believe one of the difficulties we face today in handling global affairs is that we're still divided. We still don't think of each other as being that similar, and we still find it hard to empathize with other bits of the population that's scattered around the world. We're getting better at it, but I think we really need to have a strong sense of what we are. I also think Africa has been peripheralized to a very large extent over the last couple of hundred years, and I think Africa is considered a sort of almost a residual appendix to the human story, and yet it is Africa that has produced everything that gave rise to us, whether it's in the last 65,000 years or whether it's going back millions of years. And I think if we could demonstrate effectively on fact, scientific fact, how we came into existence as the modern population, where we came from, and how we relate to humans that lived in Africa 60 to 70,000 years ago, then I think we might do something in terms of giving Africa a platform on which to stand fairly tall, in that quite clearly it would be easier for us all to recognize that Africa is the mother country, and we might therefore find it easier to empathize and sympathize in development terms and political terms with some of the problems of where we all came from, which do need addressing. I think the other thing that has intrigued me is that I had a long battle, as my opening remarks suggested, with the fundamentalism. And I have found it, I suppose, less strange today than I used to, extraordinary that people would not accept fossils. And I found it quite extraordinary that human evolution was such an anathema to so many people. And I can assure you I've had quite a battle over the last 40 years in my promoting the evolutionary story with some people who've really been very put out by the evidence that I was accumulating. But I think I'm particularly upset and concerned today because the fundamental movement in faith or religion, not just Christian religion, but Islamic religion, there's a pendulum swing to greater fundamentalism. And it's coming out as anti-science. And given the state of the world today, and the planet in terms of climate change, and some of those issues I may address later on, we cannot afford to be anti-science. Maybe you can afford to be anti-science in Portland, but you can't afford to be anti-science in the developing nations of the world, where agriculture, water, infrastructure are so determined by having human resources that are well trained in scientific method and scientific subjects. So I see the fundamentalism today as being, in a sense, anti-science, and I fear the consequences of anti-science to the survival of populations of our species, and possibly as threatening the species in its entirety. And we'll come back to that perhaps in a moment. But I think if we can find and document hard evidence of people just like us who developed the capacity to speak, living in Africa 65,000 years ago, and we can trace them through, and we can actually recover genetic material from these people by finding fossils that are buried in deposits where genetic material may have been able to survive, and we then compare that to the work that's being done today in genetics, and some of you will have already done this. You can go to a program called Genographic, where the National Geographic Society with some scientists have put together this kit where you can take a swab from your mouth and you can send it along, and for $100 they will tell you where you came from. And you will either come back from Europe or you'll come back further away from Asia, and some people are actually getting the satisfaction of tracing themselves back to Africa. Not just people who are not pigmentally challenged, but even some of us who are pigmentally challenged are finding they really are from Africa and not that long ago. I find that very, very exciting and well worth pursuing. And to me, it's important. And I would accept, as I said when I began, it may not be important to you, but it is important to me. And that's one of the reasons I'm so committed to pursue this whole issue of human origins with an emphasis on the later periods. So let's think a little bit more about humans and why it might be relevant to know a little bit more about us. I see that in part in the context of the contemporary world. As I said to a group of high school youngsters today in one of these science cafes, that it's easy to say, I'm sick and tired of being told about climate change and global warming. Everybody's talking about it, and damn it, give me a break. I don't want to hear any more about it. You people are just arguing with each other. Well, whether that's your attitude or not, you're going to have to listen to a little bit of it now. And that is one of the reasons I'm concerned about climate change. And I really don't care whether it's your fault or the fault of Russia or the fault of China or it's our fault. The issue is climate change is underway. Whether it's natural or occasioned by our attitude to burning resources for energy, is also not necessarily the problem. But climate change has happened before. And you can look at the geological record and you can see what climate change has done to this planet. And the only difference between the last major episode of climate change and this one is that one, we seem to be connected to accelerating what's happening, but doesn't matter, it's happening. And secondly, when the last time there was climate change of any severity, the world had a population of less than 1.5 million people, the world. Today, as you know, the world is populated by between 6 and 7 billion, and it's going on to 9 or 10. So climate change today is going to have a very different set of consequences for our species, because we're living in so much larger numbers, and we're occupying all of the opportunities that the planet offers. So when I say it's happened before, let me tell you that the ice ages ended about 8,500, 9,000 years ago. Huge areas of the planet were covered in ice sheets. They melted, and we get the contemporary landscape that we see, and many of you will have learned about this at one stage or other in your education, about the effect of glaciation on the land surfaces that we live and work and farm on today. It was not only the end of glaciation over large parts of the world that was important, but the implications of that climate change, getting warmer, getting drier. What did it produce? Agriculture. What else did it produce? Domestication of plants and animals. Humans, to survive, went through a fundamental change in the way we live. They lived. And it produced the seeds of sedentary life, and it produced the seeds of civilization. What we see today is a direct consequence of people living in more or less one place over hundreds of years, leads to the whole concept of the acquisitiveness in ourselves, the owning of possessions, the importance of possessions, the hoarding of resources, the collecting of resources today for tomorrow's use, and so on and so forth. This is a recent phenomenon for the majority of our species, all within the last 8,000 years, and all brought about by climate change. If climate change of a similar magnitude happens over the next 30 to 40 years, which many climate change experts believe it will, it must have a similarly dramatic impact on the way that we're living. I don't think it's going to lead to the extinction of humanity at all, but I think it will see the end of a particular pattern of life that we take for granted today in terms of how we use the planet and how we use the resources. And this is, I think, an important point to recognize the link between what was before and what is now and what may yet come. And I think it gives some substance to the argument about looking into this issue more seriously than I think has heretofore been the case, particularly in certain countries of the world where climate change has not gained much traction as an issue, at least amongst the political class. But let me not go there, because it's probably dangerous. But I do think that there is something there to be discussed. So why do I say climate change is the same order of magnitude? Well, one of the things that intrigues me is that in East Africa, we have mountains. They go up 19,000 feet, higher than your Mount Hood, but not much higher. And on these mountains, Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, and the Ruwenzori, there has been permanent ice in the form of glaciers that can be cored and dated through the isotopes trapped in the ice. And these permanent glaciers have been around or preserved, at least in terms of 15 to 20,000 years. None of the ice is that we've recorded is more recent than that. The oldest levels of that ice are sort of excess of 15, 18,000 years. It has always been there over the last 18,000 years. In the next 10 years, there will be no ice on any East African mountain. It is all melting, and it's gone. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know what causes ice to melt. You might say, well, it's a particular problem for Africa. They're just not very responsible. They burn too much brush. They create a lot of smoke. They're just not such good people. You know, we know. Well, Go across to South America and look at the Andes chain. The glaciers are melting at the same level. Go to Antarctica. You've all read it's falling apart because ice is melting. Go to the Cascades. Some of your permanent glaciers have receded by hundreds of feet, shrinking. Go to the Rockies, same story. Go across to Europe, the Alps, same story. Go across to the Himalayas, same story. Wherever you go where there's been permanent ice, it's melting tremendously fast. Not only is it melting tremendously fast, but ice is falling off the Antarctic shelves, and it's melting in Greenland and places like that. And it's not a question of scientists measuring it and trying to persuade. They're actually taking pictures of it from your space vehicles. So it's actually happening. And this is not something that we believe has ever happened before in the time period that we're talking about. So the implications are severe. It'll affect weather, it'll affect all sorts of things. And I think it needs to be taken seriously. But as far as we're concerned, not only did it force humans into sedentary life, agriculture, and domestication, but earlier climate changes forced the major steps in the human story. It is quite clear that the inception of brain growth and brain development to make and use stone implements was occasioned by climate change in Africa between 2.2 and 2.5 million years, where you find the first record of knapping stones to get a sharp cutting edge. Why did you need a sharp cutting edge? Because the climate change, the fruiting trees and the availability of plant material that these populations had been living on as gatherers disappeared and new species replaced them. There wasn't enough food to go around for frugivores, those who eat fruit and vegetable material. So what was available? Well, there were lots of antelope and lots of pigs and lots of hippo and lots of elephant and megafauna. And there were lots of carnivores, saber-toothed, tigers, lions, all sorts of magnificent beasts that would often kill these animals quite successfully because they were more successful as hunters, and they were able to eat these creatures because they had sharp cutting teeth. Our ancestors 2 million years ago didn't have sharp cutting teeth. They have teeth like ours. And if you find a deer or a moose, perhaps in Alaska, before somebody tries to skin it down, have a shot at it with your teeth and hands. And without a sharp edge, you can't cut through that flesh. You need that hunting knife. You simply, otherwise, even with an animal the size of a rabbit, have to wait till it's sufficiently putrid that you can tear the skin off. And once it's that putrid, the alimentary canal in humans isn't very good at handling the bacteria ingestion that will follow. And you'll end up with the sort of complications you probably had on occasion when you had a bad meal at a bad restaurant. So it's not a good way to live. So what was possible was you could collect all this meat lying around that carnivores were leaving behind, and we know they were there. We know that animals were being killed in large numbers because we find the fossils. But how do you access it? Somewhere, sometime, somebody learned that if you break a stone, you get a sharp edge. With a sharp edge, you can cut through hide, you can cut through tendons, and you can take off chunks of meat. What's important about meat is it's very nutritious. But not only that, is you can get big packets of meat, not the supermarket variety, but you can cut off a hind leg or what's left of it, you can cut off ribs, you can cut off pieces of meat and entrails, and you can't eat it all yourself, but because it's so large and because it's so nutritious, you actually take it and share it with other people. You can go back to a place where there might be elders or there might be nursing infants, and instead of these mothers having to wander around with a child in arm trying to get enough to survive on a daily basis, these mothers at certain times could actually be fed because there was something to take back that you could collect. Prior to that, you couldn't collect it because you didn't have stone tools. Once there was stone tools, you could collect it, and that opened up a huge opportunity for many of the things that we consider are uniquely human, that I'll come to in a minute, but that was occasioned by climate change. What about this issue of walking around on two legs like we do? That probably goes back a little more than 5 million years. I doubt if it goes more than about 6. We've not found the evidence, but at 4.5 they definitely were two-legged, and at 8 they were definitely not, as far as we can see. What brought about that shift? Well, it again was climate change. Many of the forest covers disappeared and was broken up into open woodlands, and people started to move out into the open woodlands, or people, bipedal apes, or apes that became bipedal. They were large, and one of the difficulties of woodlands is, although there are some fruiting trees, dry country trees tend to be rather fragile compared to forest trees. And if you get away about 150 pounds on average, you can't really get at the fruit, because if you climb out on the end of a branch, it breaks off and gravity takes over. So there was a premium on finding other sources of food. Again, it was climate change. So climate change has been a driving force behind our own story, but it's also been a driving force behind all of evolution. If there wasn't climate change, if habitats didn't respond to climate change the way they have, we certainly wouldn't be here, nor would anything else. We would have been static from the time of first life. So climate change, environmental change, following that is critical, and it has been throughout the eons, and it will be critical in our time too. So what else can I draw from this story? One of the things that interests me a lot about bipedalism, which I'll share with you, is that we like to think of ourselves as very efficient, and some people like to portray humans as the sort of a top point in the pyramid of life, and everything ultimately, to be really successful, needs to be like us. Well, that's wrong, but let's not get into that. One of the difficulties of being bipedal, as opposed to quadrupedal, 2 legs as opposed to 4, is that if you're 4-legged, you can lose 1 leg completely and you can still get about. Many of you will have seen dogs and cats and squirrels who've lost a leg. Wild animals are the same. On 3 legs, you can do an awful lot, and some dogs I have seen can get around pretty well on 2 legs, provided they're on opposite sides. The one that's off, on one front left and one back right, you can still get around. But if you lose your legs as a biped, and you haven't got wings to take off with, you don't go anywhere. And I know that because I lost my legs. I had a plane accident about 1993, and in the air crash, the engine of the Cessna that I was flying came back and took my legs off just below the knee. And I was hospitalized for a long time, and then had a long time to think about this, and I realized how utterly dependent I was on everybody. It's not that I was particularly ill, but with no legs, I couldn't leave my bed. Then I had one amputated, and I thought, well, that's terrific. Now I shall be able to move around. And they bought me a first artificial leg. But with 1 leg, you can't go anywhere. And if you think about how many individuals have lived over the last 5 million years in Africa, not as a big population, but even as an individual living 30 or 40 years, you can't walk around Africa in the savannah without shoes and not get a thorn that goes septic, not twist your ankle or twist your knee and find yourself immobilized, let alone breaking your leg. The thing that enabled people to survive, or our ancestors survive, was that they had bonds. They had a social organization that allowed individuals to look after other individuals. And we have fossils of hominids that go back 2 and just over 2 million years, where clearly the femur, the thigh bone, had broken. And it's set almost perfectly as if a doctor had done it. Now, clearly there weren't any doctors, but it's clear that that individual was immobilized for 6 weeks. And you can't be immobilized in Africa for 6 days, let alone 6 weeks, unless there are people to look after you, because something will eat you pretty quickly and you won't get water. So there's an enormous amount to be drawn from this bipedal adaptation that is very ancient. And it is that intrigues me. Yes, the big brain is important. The use of initial technology is important. The spread out of Africa 1.7 million years ago with Homo erectus is important. There are lots of important points. We understand a lot of it, and I don't want to give you a boring talk this evening about that. But you can read it, you can find out about it. But the big picture is that we have a very respectable pedigree going way back. The keys are bipedalism an expansion of the brain, the development of technology, and ultimately the development of agriculture and domestication, all occasioned by climate change. What is climate change going to do to us in the next 30 years? Big question, one that I don't have easy answers to, but well worth thinking about next time you think you're fed up with this talk. Just think about some of the issues behind that talk that might intrigue you and lead you to think a little more deeply about it. So in summary, and I want to leave some time for questions, and I'm not in a particular hurry to end it, but I think it is important in a talk like this to emphasize that for somebody like me, answering these questions gives validity to what we are today. It gives a competence to some of the thinking that we have to do today in terms of survival. I think a lot of people have asked me, is evolution continuing? And it's an important question that I can anticipate, if you like, from some of you in the room tonight. Evolution continues, but not in humans. And one of the reasons for that is the theoretical context for evolution, which is, if you like, change through, in crude terms, adaptation through natural selection. And there are lots of ways that can be discussed in depth. But the point is that organisms are supposed to have enough genetic variation that under changed circumstances, some will do better than others. Those that do better than others will survive longer, breed amongst themselves, and gradually over time you will shift the genetic center and have a new species emerging from an old species. This you do in domestication of animals. You can produce cows that have big udders and liters of milk, produce pigs that have long backs and have bacon, horses that have long legs and can run fast, and we've domesticated everything we lay our hands on, including genetic interference with crops, so they can grow in salty places, they can grow with more water, less water. And this is the manipulation of the genome by the human agency, whereas evolution is when it's altered by natural processes. So that's the basic definition. You need a long generation time for natural selection to occur, and you need to be isolated. We are unlikely to isolate any part of our population for more than most 3 or 4 generations at best. You'd probably need several hundred generations to see any shift in the mean of genetic characterization of a particular species. So where's evolution happening? It's not happening with elephants, it's not happening with chimpanzees, probably because the same sort of problems prevail with them now, the way we live on this planet. But where evolution is happening almost as we watch, and where we probably have the greatest threat, is that these little microorganisms like virus and bacteria, which can multiply with many generations in a 24-hour period, over a period of a year or two, there can be hundreds of thousands, millions of generations, and these little pathogens have genes too. And they can change them. They can select one against the other. And it is the evolution of the microorganisms, the evolution of things that cause us to have disease, that is something of concern. And HIV, AIDS, some of the other viruses that are threatening are bad enough. But there's no question that we are creating environments in hospitals where you get the superbug. We'll create others. We are incubating a problem by the way we handle ourselves in this vast population that we're part of. And I think if you're not persuaded by evolution, you shouldn't worry about getting flu jabs every year that has been slightly modified to deal with a new species. Don't worry about it. If evolution isn't true, nothing's going to get you. You're fine. I'd be careful, though, with going down that road, and might be worth consulting other than Leakey and get some advice on that. So evolution is happening perfectly well, and the nice thing about it, well, it's not a nice thing, but the good thing about it is we can now study it under microscopes. We can study it with all the techniques that are now available to look at some of these things. And although it's not exactly the way Darwin thought it would be, he was broadly right in a lot of his thinking, and has to be given credit, I think, for changing the paradigm of how we think of life on this planet and where life may be going. So I think that's one aspect that I wanted to touch on. I think the final aspect that I wanted to touch on, and that is where is the species going? Well, I think one of the things that we must do is recognize that this species is characterized by being too numerous. There are too many people on the planet. And I'm not saying that in any negative sense against any population. But the carrying capacity of an ecosystem can be determined. You can determine how many horses you keep in a paddock, you can determine how many cattle you keep on a farm, you can determine how many deer there should be for the habitat to survive, you can determine probably the numbers of elephants and things of that kind. And you certainly can determine the number of humans that are sustainable on this planet, particularly if all wish to achieve a standard of living equivalent to that you enjoy here. And we're too many. If every living person wanted to have in a family 2 cars and 4 television sets and unlimited supplies of water and food, the world simply could not sustain that. So one of the interesting questions that I put to some of the younger people I spoke to today is, in solving this problem, they need to think, and I say they because I think it is the younger people who have to go down this road. Some of us are no longer responsible, and I always say to people that, one of the greatest joys I have is to know that mortality is real. It's not our problem. However, put that aside as you may, what is it about the way you live? You have the highest standard of living in the world, and we all aspire to it, or I don't, but many do. Is it that you have lots of food and lots of cars and lots of technology? Maybe. But why is it associated with such wastage? Why is it that people throw away so much food at restaurants, cafeterias? Does that make you better than people living in a poorer regime, to throw away things? The wastage in Western society is phenomenal. And all of what we're throwing away has cost something somewhere to produce. And we are overusing our energy, we're overusing our resources, and we're throwing it away. I think one of the biggest challenges, perhaps not for Portland, because you have obviously lots of weather here that produces enough water, but water is a crisis. Water is a crisis all over the world. And the way water is used is fundamental to an indication of our attitude to waste. And I said to these young people today, how many of you can honestly say that when you take a shower, you're conscious of the fact that the world has limited supplies of water? Most people in the West, particularly in this country, as far as I know from personal surveys, not that many, but nonetheless, about as many as some of the Gallup polls lead us astray. Turn on the faucet, get the temperature right, step into it when you put everything down, get under the shower, water cascading full blow on you, and then you try and soap while you're getting wet, and the soap doesn't stick, so you keep soaping for a long time, water pouring down you. And then you stand there because it's nice on the back and nice on the front and nice on the head, and it's a sort of massagey sort of feeling. And then you think, well, I better get out of here, and then you think, oh no, I must wash my hair, and then you wash your hair under this, and then you didn't wash it enough because it's still soapy, and then you put the conditioner. I mean, you use gallons and gallons and gallons of water, whereas in fact all you need to do is get wet, soap yourself down, rinse it off, and get out. You could reduce your water consumption by massive amounts. Should you? I don't know. It depends on your attitude to waste. We don't shower like that at our place in Kenya because there isn't the water. And I grew up in a family where on safari, we boys, and boys are dirty, they get in the dirt on every possible opportunity, and these were dusty places. My mother said you get 1 cup of water a day to get clean, and you're unacceptable if you're dirty. So we learned to use a little bit of cloth and clean a little bit under this arm and a little bit here and there. And although we probably were still quite dirty, we felt refreshed, and we were apparently acceptable to my mother because she didn't have us somehow lost in the wilds of Africa. So I would just come back and say, in tackling the world's problems, in tackling the crisis of energy, in tackling the crisis of resources, I don't believe it's necessary to waste. And if we could cut out waste, I think we would make a massive contribution to the resources that are left to be developed in other ways and other times for other people. So that's just my personal plea in looking at this. Have I thought about it? Yes. Leave the lights on in a hotel room, Well, you know, you've paid your bill, it's up to the hotel to have some sort of system to turn them off. But why should you waste the energy, even if it's the hotel's energy? It's coming from somewhere. On an optimistic note, I think you in the United States, through your people power, have produced incredible changes. And I think the fact that many towns and cities are cleaned up, many highways are being cleaned up, many industrial areas are being refurbished and made livable again. Clean energy is on the debate in all discussions taking place at all levels. I hear either in Oregon or in Washington, they're talking about undamming hydroelectric schemes so fish can swim up to spawn where they used to spawn. These are remarkable changes in my short lifetime. If we can do that in 40, 50 years, surely we can do the other things over the next 30, 40 years and make the world livable again. Not just for those who are fortunate, but for the species. Let's come to a species level and look at our future on that basis. Let me stop there and take some questions from you, because I think that would be appropriate. Thank you. Hand or ask a question. I will repeat the question so that everybody hears it, and I may slightly change the question so I can answer it, and we'll proceed. So that way also we can avoid lectures, which those sort of devices can sometimes encourage. And you've already had one, you don't need two or three. So who would like to start? Yep, go ahead, sir.
How big was that population group 65,000 years ago? And was it geographically centered, and how big was that?
As far as we know from the modern genetic studies that have been done, we are talking about a population that almost certainly didn't exceed 2,000 to 3,000 individuals, and they almost certainly lived in one geographic focus somewhere in East Central Africa. It is that population, that very limited population, that provides evidence of the bottleneck, and the genetics attest to that. It was certainly not much bigger than that. And it was somewhere in Central Africa, and probably a single population that got ahead of the game and subsequently were more successful than the others. Yes, ma'am.
I'm also intrigued by the 65,000-year-old question. I'm sure you've looked. Was there a climate change or an environmental change 65,000 years ago that you can see in the geologic record that may have accounted for the evolution of language, etc.?
Well, we think there was, although I have to tell you that the deposits, the sediments which would preserve fossils and their evidence are remarkably scarce in Africa, where we think this happened, for that time period. And the reason for that is at the end of the ice ages, there was massive erosion, and much of that earlier sediment has washed away, and some of the other places where you might expect to find it are covered by more recent sediments. But in the last couple of years, we have found a number of sites in East Africa that I think hold the potential for answering that question. But at the moment, there isn't very much evidence to go along with the story that we're telling. But I think the initial prospecting suggests that the evidence will be coming in over the next decade, and we'll answer that question very solidly. Or that's my hope, at any rate.
Thank you.
Yes, one more on this side, and then I'll come upstairs. No, I'll go upstairs first. That's what we do fair. This is a fair country.
Thank you. I just wanted to know, considering the fact that extinction of many species continue at a rapid pace, obviously, and we're spoiling the environment and we're using up natural resources, I just finished reading your book, The Sixth Extinction, recently, and I'm wondering if in the last 15 years, if your confidence about our ability to avoid our role in causing the sixth extinction, if you feel more confident that we're moving in the right direction, or do you understand my question? I guess I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that right now.
I have a feeling that if I was honest, which I'd like to be, I would say I feel far less confident than I did when I wrote that book with Roger Lewin. And the reason I'm less confident is that 15 years ago, 18 years ago, when we were thinking about the book, we weren't really talking about climate change. We were talking about the growth of human development and the growth of the impact of human society. And we weren't setting that against the climate change issue that we now see. The reason I'm pessimistic and worried is that if you think about it, 110 years ago, people, initially here with Yosemite and Yellowstone, realized that agriculture was threatening the existence of natural species, and they came up with this idea of forming national parks. You create an area that is pristine, that is safe, and humans will not interfere with the species in them. And it's like creating a big larder. Put everything in there, and even though you're doing bad things somewhere else, at least you've done your bit for nature, and you've created this storage area for the species. We've done it in North America, Central America, South America, all across Africa, all across Europe. It's a universal phenomenon, national parks. But if you look at the record, the paleontological record, wherever climate change has been dramatic, island faunas, island communities of different species, are the first to disappear. And the reason for that is that in significant climate change, on an island you can't get off. And I think what we did inadvertently over the last 100 years is create many, many islands. And they can't get out of these wretched parks now because we've got farms and we've got cities and we've got development. And our species that were to be preserved are in fact entrapped. And in that entrapment, we may well have set a guarantee that hundreds of species that might have survived if the boundaries of these parks had been designed with climate change in mind will now perish. Now, there is undoubtedly some opportunity to study this and perhaps find some method by which the problem can be at least adapted. But I think the impact on climate change to nature is going to be as great as it is to human society. And I therefore am not at all sanguine about the success that we can show by creating national parks today. And I think we may have done quite the wrong thing, and it's too late to change it. And we're going to have to take steps over the next 10, 15 years where we hold the real estate, we look to manage the real estate, and more importantly, we hold the genetic material there or somewhere else so that we can rebuild communities of wildlife some years in the future when this issue is brought more under control than it is today. And I think the focus, if you like, of conservation is altering as we talk, but very few of the conservationists are necessarily aware of what the ground is doing under their feet. Yes?
Thanks for coming back to me. This question is somewhat special for me, or asking a question, because over 40 years ago I had the chance to ask your father a question. I believe it was in 1966 when he gave a lecture in California. My question to you is about a topic maybe a little controversial you raised, and it's about the issue of the chimpanzee human hybrid possibility. Decades ago, when I learned that possibility maybe existed and we didn't know for sure, I was astounded. And I've also thought in some ways it was a legitimate scientific question, but professional anthropologists seem to just condemn that morally, which you seem to do. Stephen Jay Gould used language I think a little hyperbolic in saying he considered that would be the most morally reprehensible experiment of all time. My question to you is, isn't there some legitimate scientific purpose in answering that question? And from the point of view of how we humans view ourselves, which is what partly the study of anthropology is about, wouldn't that go to the central issue of how we fit into the animal kingdom? Doesn't that deserve some scientific respect, or is it only enough to give it moral condemnation?
Well, if by manipulating the egg and the sperm of two separate species through this experiment, If that was the only way we could learn, then I think you might have an argument. But as we know that they could cross, as we know they could produce offspring, as the genetics can be looked at and paired and measured, there's no need to do it. I don't think we're gaining anything. And I'm not sure crossing a human with a chimp would satisfy the fundamentalist crowd any more than the evidence from genetics would. I think it would make it more difficult to persuade them. So no, I don't think, yes, are there more morally reprehensible things we could do? Of course there are, but we weren't talking about those. I just think it's unnecessary to produce an offspring between a chimp and a human to answer the question of our place and their place in the scheme of things. I think we can do it perfectly well by molecular biology and genetics and other things of that kind. And I think it's being done, has been done. We know the relationship. We're beginning to unravel the mysteries of the genome in a number of different species. And we don't need to resort to the sort of crude approaches that characterize the 30s, in my opinion. How reprehensible is the morality of this issue? You know, it depends who you are, but I don't think we should do it. I don't think we should do it at all, because I don't think it's going to advance our position one jot that we can't do by better ways. That's all I would say. Yes?
I'm a 6th grader in Westland, and in social studies today, we were talking about our evolution to the road we are on today, and my teacher said communication, talking, but why did our grunts and body gestures evolve into speech, and chimps and apes' primitive communication didn't? I mean, is it a scientific brain thing or just a coincidence?
Well, I think the question you ask is a valid question, and I don't think we necessarily understand what might have precipitated the shift from body language and grunts to syntactic language. And we don't know why, if we're right, that it came so late in the human story. Big puzzle, we don't know, but I think we need to study this a lot more closely. But what is very clear is that despite having language, we don't use it very well because most of us misunderstand each other all the time. And I mean, we have difficulty talking between spouses, we have difficulty talking with our children, we have difficulty talking across nations, it is a huge problem. I mean, if you want to find a parallel where it works, is take some of the social insects like the termites or the social ants. They have pheromone conversations, and everybody knows exactly what they should do and never vary from their instruction. Now, we used to, obviously, or we have inherited a degree of pheromone and body language, but we have lost the ability to even understand that. And when somebody puts on some body language, most of us are not quite sure what they're trying to tell us. And when somebody comes through with a particular body aroma, our first thought is that they should wash more thoroughly. But they may have lots of messages that they're washing away every time they go to the shower. So I'm for body language and pheromones, but to a degree. But why we turn to syntactic language is one of the outstanding questions of our time. At the top.
I was wondering if you would have a comment on the suggestion that there was some bottleneck in the past in which our ancestors lived primarily in water.
The suggestion that a bottleneck in the past was an occasion when our ancestors primarily lived in water. This was the Sir Alister Hardy and the good lady after her, whose name has slipped me at the moment, but I know exactly who you mean. I see no evidence that we lived in water. I think we can have subcutaneous fat and hairs that fall in a particular direction and all the other things that we do, including being able to swim after some valiant attempts to learn, in my case. No, I don't think there's a shred of evidence. It's all hypothetical, it's all coincidental and anecdotal. And I think in science one's got to come up with a hypothesis that you can prove, not a hypothesis that you can never prove. And I think the aquatic theory of our origin is just that. It's a concept that is taking circumstantial evidence and anecdotal stories, and there's no proof at all. And so I would reject it out of hand. I'm a little bit blunt about these things, and I don't see any merit in holding that as an alternative option for us to select from. Sorry about that. And the first time I answered that question, just for your interest, was from a lady, and I was probably a little less polite than I've been just now. And the lady is the one who had written the most recent book on the subject. In trouble. Yes.
Hi, I am curious about what you were talking about with the carrying capacity of the Earth and wondering what you think that number is for the human population. And then part two of the question is, what do you see politically, technologically, and socially in our future to kind of combat the overpopulation issues and maybe work towards that ideal number if there is one?
I don't know what the carrying capacity is. I just believe we've exceeded it dramatically because of what I see going on in the planet. And although we're close to 7 billion now, we're going to be 12 before we turn it around. I just don't see how we can sustain that on this planet. That's point one. What the ideal number is hard to determine. I think ecologists and others could do it, but I think we've got to also factor in the subject I raised earlier, and that is what our aspirations are in terms of the standard of living and how much of that is taken up by waste. And I think that's a factor. The third thing I would say is about how we combat it. One of the high school groups asked me a question today, and they said, if I was king of the world with absolute power, what are the 3 issues that I would want to focus on? And one of the first issues I raised was the population size of the planet. It's an enormously important issue. How do you go about it? Well, I don't think you can take the route that has been taken where it's illegal to have 2 children, where you kill girl children or boy children, depending on your prejudice, which is changing through time. I don't think you should kill children. Can you legislate about larger families? Can you penalize in terms of some form of taxation? All of these things are possible, but awkward morally, ethically, but I think they need to be addressed. And I think one of the most fundamental ways, which may or may not be popular in this society of deregulation and freewheeling capitalism and all of these things, which I don't fully understand myself, but the point is, if people are not desperately poor and have a standard of living that is reasonably good, which will be degraded if there are too many in a family, most people will opt for smaller families. And it's a very interesting fact that in Kenya, for a while, primary education, the first 8 years of school, was quite expensive. And it was expensive because you had to pay school fees, and it was expensive because you had to buy uniforms, and you had to buy books, and you had to pay activity fees. And many, many families found it extremely difficult to put all their kids through school. And yet, unless they put them through school, they were going to stay in the poverty trap that was spiraling downwards. And the extent with which Kenyan people committed to have smaller families so they could educate them all was quite dramatic, and it brought our growth figures down from what I think had been close to 4 to less than 2.4 in a period of 10 or 15 years. Under pressure from well-meaning friends in different parts of the world, the Kenya government was persuaded to make education free. And so the incentive for small families has been withdrawn with the best intention, but probably the worst possible result. So you never know the advice you get, whether it's good or bad, but I think basic increase in modest affluence and development is probably the best bet of all in terms of bringing the population to a point of stabilization. And many countries that are well off, some of the Scandinavian countries, some of the European countries, now have negative population. And I believe in this country, you could have negative population if you didn't have such a large influx, as you've always had, of people coming across the oceans to join you. It's not difficult to get to stability or indeed neutral population growth once you're affluent. And I think that is probably the least objectionable way to go. And again, I say if you cut out waste, it may not be that difficult to achieve, because you could give people a much better standard of living without depleting the world's resources. But if you're going to do that, you carry an element of responsibility as an individual benefiting from that growth to your earnings. And I think that's very important, and we need to teach that at all levels of society. There's some younger people there I want to talk to, yes?
Hello?
Oh, you're not young at all, I can hear, but speak up. But they're small people then.
We go to Roosevelt High School, and we just were wondering, at what point did you know that you were interested in science?
Say that again.
At what point in your life did you know you were interested in science?
What point in my life did I realize I was interested in science? Well, I wasn't for a very long time, because I resisted science. Well, I resisted my parents. I detested learning. School was the worst part of my early childhood. I got out of it just as quick as I could. I was a high school dropout, never graduated from high school. And although I have all these fancy names today, don't take them seriously. They're just feathers that you stick in your cap later on in life. I am interested in science because I think it's the right way to go. I think it does give us empirical, factual answers to important questions, and that's why I'm doing it. Now I'm going to take one more question at the top, one on the left and one on the right, and so count out where you are, and so it's 1, 2, 3. And behind that young lady, you should have to fall back, because I'm not going to answer your question because I want to get out of here. I have 2 artificial legs, and they're tired. So, you next.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the possible coming epidemics of microorganisms and mutant bacteria, and what do you think, how humans are going to adapt or not adapt to dealing with those, and if you have any ideas on what we may be able to do to help ourselves.
I think we could do so much to help ourselves. I mean, I don't think we're a failed species, and I don't think that the inevitability is extinction by any manner of means at all. But I think we've got to recognize, in addressing some of the points that you raised, which I don't want to go into depth in, and I'm not being evasive like some people have been recently in answering your question. It's a matter of time. But I think if we reflect on the fact that we educate, we inform, and we can provide future generations with enormous amounts of information, and we can teach them how to use that information to better the planet and to better themselves. And I think we've got to take a long, hard look at a number of issues in education. And in this part of the world, for example, I think there's certain things about education that should be taught by dictate. I think kids should learn geography right from the start. They need to know what the world consists of in terms of other people, other countries, other economies. And you should start that at the age of 6 or 7, and it should be mandatory that you do geography until you can pass reasonably well in an examination or some sort of testing system as to what countries are on which side of which ocean, what their populations are, what their religions are, and what their natural resources are, and what their economic prospects are. This is fundamental to being a citizen of the world. I think you can teach young generations many different things. There's never been a generation that has as much information literally at their fingertip through Google and things of that kind. But we're not teaching people to be curious and want to access it. If we can teach people to feel desperate for a Coke, surely we can make them desperate to learn more. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so my question has to deal with both waste and the overpopulation in the world. How do you think that artificial processes for creating fertilizers, such as the Haber-Bosch process, have influenced this problem?
Well, clearly mistakes have been made, and we have, but you know, agricultural revolutions, the use of fertilizer, pesticides, yeah, I mean, we're proceeding along a path without necessarily looking at where it's taking us in many cases. But I think in the last decade, the opportunities to know what we should and shouldn't do are enormous. But we don't check. I mean, the most ill-equipped, poorly informed group of people are politicians. Not just here, everywhere. And why on earth do we allow it? Why can't we demand representation, if we have to have it, to be better informed? And I have a feeling that in the next 50 or so years, organized government, representative government, is going to be replaced by the web and things of that kind, where we all participate collectively in formulating rules and regulations that get us ahead, rather than entrusting some person somewhere at some time to lead us. I'm not sure we need that sort of leadership. We need a different sort of leadership today. That would be my sense of where we're going. But yes, we've made mistakes, and we're going to go on making mistakes. And we make them regularly. But I think the younger generation could be taught, if not this generation of 16-year-olds, this generation of 4-year-olds could be taught to avoid those pitfalls if we put our mind to it. If we want to do something, we can do it. We only do it if we think it's necessary. Surely the writing is on the world, it's essential to do it. Last question from that young lady.
What was our oldest ancestor?
What is the oldest of our ancestors? Was that the question? Yes? Yes. Okay. The oldest of our ancestors would depend on who you think is our ancestor. I think humans, that is, something that walks on two legs but doesn't fly, i.e. not a bird which works on two legs, but us, probably goes back between 6 and 7 million years. We, people who could have come here tonight and joined us in this lecture and not caused you to have nightmares, probably go back about 200,000 years. And we, in terms of people that you are directly related to, 65,000 years ago. So all of those are ancestors, but it depends which one you want to choose to identify with. And probably at your stage in life, I wouldn't go much beyond your grandparents, but as you're a little older, you go back by increments until you can sort that out for yourself. But we've been around an awfully long time, and only recently have we done things so stupidly to endanger the planet. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you.